Welcome to The Human Experience, a podcast about the stories we live out every day and the importance of championing the vulnerability and courage of the storyteller. I'm your host, Jennifer Peterkin, and it was through my own lived story of experiencing domestic violence that this podcast was created. By traveling the globe and interviewing each guest in person, I am convinced now more than ever that stories have the power to change the world. You can join our community of storytellers by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, signing up for my newsletter, following me on Instagram, and more. Thank you for being here. In a world full of noise, to listen with intention is an act of resistance. Katrina, thank you so much for doing an interview with me today and for having us in your home to do it. That's always a nice, cozy way to sit down with somebody and have a conversation. So we are in Illinois, outside of Chicago. I'm really excited to hear about your story and your life.
Thank you, Jennifer, for having me on your show, The Human Experience. And it's truly an honor to be able to share my story. I've been doing speaking live and through podcasts, interviews, radio, TV for, I'd say, beginning of 2022.
Okay.
And so some months I do maybe 3 or 4 a month, and some months it's 1 or 2.
Yeah.
So, that's really, podcasts are a lot. I'm working on more live events and really sharing stories to inspire people towards generosity.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Towards generosity. So you are a physician.
Yes.
But that's not where your story starts, obviously. And you came here to the States as a baby. Is that correct?
Yes. In April 30th, 1975 was the end of the Vietnam War. I was born February 22nd of 1974. So I was about 14 months old. And my family and I was the youngest of 8 children at that time. My dad was a fisherman by trade, and he put all of us on his fishing boat and took us out to sea, just hoping to be rescued, because otherwise, it was the choice of life and death, staying behind or leaving.
Wow.
And leaving was the choice that he made for all of us.
Wow. I can't imagine that too. I mean, on several levels, but to just board a fishing boat and hope and pray for the best. What desperation must be felt for that to be the decision that you make.
Yeah, and I don't think that I or any of my siblings really reflected on the profound, difficult decision that my dad had to make at the time, because he never really talked about how difficult it was. He was just a matter of fact thing, like, what's the choice? Like, I want my family to have a chance for freedom and survival. And he, being as a fisherman, he was fortunate. He looked at himself as fortunate enough to be by the sea as a way of escape, where, if you were connected to nobility and the government or the military in Vietnam at the time, or connections to the U.S. military within that war, you may have a chance to be flown out of the country in the midst of disaster, chaos, and war. So he never looked at it as like, gosh, I didn't have a chance. He looked at it as, what chance do I have? And what he had was more than other people had, which is a mode of transportation through sea.
Yeah.
But, growing up, I would say, because we came to the U.S. in the settlement in Guam, which is the first U.S. settlement. And we were among, hundreds of thousands of boat people at the time. So our story growing up, we felt like we were just one of, hundreds of thousands of boat people escaping communist Vietnam after a war. But I think I learned as I got older that is quite unique. And the challenge that my dad had to face to make that decision for us to be rescued and to find freedom and opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know if there was a tipping point for him in terms of what caused him to actually make the decision? Because I'm sure your parents were thinking about it for quite a while, but to actually make the decision.
Yeah, so my mom was an orphan since she was 7 years old. She grew up in North Vietnam. By the time she was 17, she married my dad, who was 22. And he was part of Central Vietnam, but very border to North. So they met at a religious festival. And their parents knew each other. So if you asked me, was their marriage arranged? Not really. They kind of knew each other, but it It wasn't like, hey, when they got married was the first time they met, that kind of thing. So being that she was the youngest and an orphan at such a young age, she got married early. But it wasn't for like 5 years till they had their first child. So I'm one of 10 children currently. There in the 1950s, there was the migration from north to south. And, the French involvement with that. So first, communist involvement in moving people, forcing people to move from north to south if you didn't support the communist government. And so that was the first escape, technically. And they observed throughout, decades that there was a constant religious persecution of Catholics. And my oldest brother was training at the seminary to become a Catholic priest. My parents knew a lot of politicians in the South Vietnamese government who were being persecuted and eventually assassinated for their faith and for the defense of democracy and freedom, and fighting alongside the U.S. military. So they saw all the signs along the way. And then when the communists invaded the South, and, the last president was Ngo Dinh Diem. He was a bachelor Catholic. His family was very, involved in the church as priests and bishops. And they were imprisoned and assassinated and exiled. You name it, they went through everything.
Wow.
So ultimately we saw like the writing on the wall, right? It's going to happen. And we saw, friends, neighbors sent to re-education camps when they were captured or attempts to escape, knowing how involved they were in the military and fighting on the South Vietnamese side in the U.S. military. So many of those people were sent to prison and camps and were in isolation, and some died, some made it. Yeah. So it wasn't like a one moment, but it was something over decades that was observed, and ultimately they saw it was coming. Yeah. So they had to make plans eventually.
Yeah. And at the time you said you were the eighth child. So were your parents able to take all of you with them?
Yes. So my younger sister was born in Guam in July of 1976, and my youngest brother in March of 1978 in Louisiana. Okay. So all of the children. So we look at it as a fortunate thing because many children in the midst of war are left behind, or orphaned, died, from the war, caught in the middle of gunfire and artillery, drowning at sea, starvation, dehydration, illness, that kind of thing. So we always look back at the gratitude, which is look at the great things that happen, and not like, oh, I wish we, could be in our homeland, right? Look at the opportunities and ways that we have prospered because of being here. Yeah. So that journey on the boat, how long were you guys on the boat? So my understanding is, April 30th, and then by the time we were rescued and brought to the Philippines, it was about 5 to 6 days. Okay. Yeah. And then from there, our paperwork was processed. And then eventually, within a few days or a week, we were flown to Guam. Okay. So probably May of 1975, we were there. And then my sister was born July of 76. And somewhere between 76 and 78, we're in Louisiana. Okay. It's like now that my parents have passed, I don't have the paperwork to say, hey, this is exactly dates. But just based on the birth records of my siblings, that's an estimate. Yeah. I mean, 5 to 6 days, I'm assuming, it's not like you were on a fully stocked ship or anything like that. No. So. Actually, when my dad had to abandon the fishing boat and there was kind of a floating barge of 5,000 people, when we abandoned the fishing boat, we had to leave supplies. And the only thing we were able to bring was some bags of noodles and water. Because, you got people on there, you can't just bring everything because it's limited. And then from the barge, then there was a humanitarian merchant ship that rescued us off of the barge and then brought us to the Philippines. Okay. So, I always share this is that I didn't realize that I nearly died twice during this whole journey to freedom. Once is during a transfer from the barge to the humanitarian merchant ship that the transfer children are kind of like you throw them,
Yeah.
and somebody catches them in the other end, and somebody almost didn't catch me,
Oh,
and I would have, fallen into the sea, just by the catching of the leg. So that was one time. I consider that kind of a near-death experience.
yes.
That I don't remember, but my parents remember watching it happen.
Yeah.
It nearly happened. And then the other time was being in the refugee camp in Guam. I was very sick with some kind of head and neck infection that didn't respond to antibiotics. And I had to have some kind of surgical procedure that put me under anesthesia. And basically my parents were told that they weren't sure if I would survive. So my parents said that they were actually looking for a burial site for me in Guam. And so that's another truly near-death experience. So I feel very blessed knowing that story about my childhood, like during toddler years. And I think that's the driving force behind why I felt like there was this seed in my heart to become a doctor, and as much as I wanted to suppress that, I don't want to spend 10, 12 years in training, it just was, the passion was there, and it just got ignited when I was around the right people with the right experiences.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective, having these experiences that you don't remember because you were too young. How old was your oldest sibling that went on the journey?
At the time, he was about 18.
Okay, wow.
When we first left,
So he has a completely different perspective.
Yeah. Like I said, he was training in the seminary.
Yeah.
So by the time he was 12 years old, he was already an altar boy.
Okay.
And my uncle, who just passed away last year, he served, my uncle when he was a priest, and then went on to seminary training in South Vietnam.
Okay.
So he was actually like fluent in French and Vietnamese. Very little English, because that wasn't something that was taught in Vietnamese schools or seminary. So even though he was older, it was still a challenge because coming to a refugee camp where, neither anybody spoke Vietnamese or French.
Right.
Then he had to kind of use some French to understand English.
Yeah.
So that's how he got through it. But he would tell us today if we wanted to go to Guam, like he would remember every place. He could take us places and where we were in the camps and where my sister was born and where he worked menial jobs just to get some income so that we could eventually get flown to Louisiana.
Yeah.
when we were sponsored. Yeah.
And so how big was that refugee camp in Guam?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Probably, I would say like in the thousands to 100,000s.
Yeah.
Because it was a big, they call it Operation New Life, was part of the boat people.
Okay.
So just imagine the chaos of war and everybody trying to escape.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And was it mostly Vietnamese?
Yeah, I would say so. There's also many Chinese people who were born in Vietnam.
Okay.
So we will meet, like even nowadays, we'll meet people who speak Vietnamese but are ethnically Chinese, born in China.
Yeah.
Actually migrated to Vietnam at some point, maybe got married and had other children. There's also, Cambodians,
Sure.
Malaysians in the mix, So.
Yeah.
But I would say majority were Vietnamese.
And we're escaping the communist regime in Vietnam.
Yep.
Yeah. It's just really interesting because there were so many of you and the age differences between you guys. Do you find that depending on where you are in the lineup, do you find that you have different perspectives on how things happened and why they happened? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's actually a 20-year difference from the oldest brother to my youngest brother.
Okay. And
I would say, like, growing up, it was always the three youngest. So I'm like, even though I was born in Vietnam, I'm always the three youngest kids,
Yeah, yeah.
It's always like you sat at the little kids' table at dinner until you knew how to learn how to use chopsticks, know? And even when my cousins would come over, it's like they had priority at the big adult table. The 5 older siblings versus the 5 younger, difference like culturally, how we looked at things. I would say in conversation, my older siblings would always have to remind us to speak Vietnamese at home,
Yeah.
And then, like, it wasn't natural for us because we grew up learning English and Vietnamese at the same time. But, we had friends who spoke English more. We weren't really as immersed in Vietnamese culture before we, in childhood. And so that was a challenge. But my parents tried their best to make sure that our home environment was, involved like Vietnamese magazine, Vietnamese music, Vietnamese TV, ate Vietnamese food, took us to relatives on special holidays, and prioritized keeping certain traditions.
Yeah.
And even in religious education, we would learn it in Vietnamese. So I learned all my prayers in Vietnamese, and it wasn't until I went to college I'm like, oh, that's how you say this in English. And then I married my husband. He's Filipino.
Okay.
And he converted to the faith in 2007. So I had to pray with him in English. And sometimes when I go back to with my family in California, and they always say, pray this in English, so like Mark can pray with us, because he's the only one that's not Vietnamese in the family that we married.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. But I think the perspective of the war and what happened.
Yeah.
When I was in third grade, I remember writing a kind of a book report about the last Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem. And, growing up, like all I heard was how great he was because he was fighting for South Vietnam and freedom and fighting communism. And that was the only perspective I knew. And then I went to college and I took a Vietnamese American experience, is what it's called. It's a class in college, probably my third or fourth year of college, taught by a Vietnamese professor that I believe he served in the South Vietnamese Army as well. So I had perspective, directly. And reading books, related to different eras and culture and the influence of like Chinese culture, French culture, and religion, and the customs that changed, the way the language changed, fashion, food. And I realized that the perspective of war depends on where you live and your generation, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's really no winners when it comes to war, and especially when it involves women and children. There's always people who are innocent that are affected by it. And so, I think it's just a perspective, like I don't go, oh, here's my hero,
Sure.
Yeah. But I think the bottom line is all of us, wherever we're born, we would love to stay in the country where we're born. We wouldn't want a force, a war, or a politician, or a movement to drive us outside of our country. And I think that's important to consider in terms of the perspective on war.
Yeah.
So, I'm always like, no war is good. There are no winners.
Yeah. Yes.
And we need to respect the fact that people love their country and would prefer to stay there if opportunities were available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can't say I understand because I've never had to leave my country and I've not been in that position, but I can try to empathize with that feeling because I can't imagine having to make that decision. I can't imagine being your parents and having to make that decision with 8 children. And to just not know what the future holds to such a degree. I mean, none of us know, but we can have pretty good projections, right? Until something completely rocks your world.
Yeah. And I think like the big thing was just observing, crime and persecution, just getting closer and closer to home for them at the time. I think the big challenge, like even nowadays, is to recognize like religious persecution, even without war.
Yeah.
Right? Even in countries that doesn't seem like there's a war obvious to the world, but at the village or community, local level, it's happening.
Sure.
And I think that was a big part of my parents to see, like, there's no way we can keep the faith and practice and go to church and receive the sacraments and, raise our children if they wanted to become religious leaders like my brothers are.
Yeah.
2 out of the 10 children, 2 of my brothers are Catholic priests currently.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, 30 and 40 years now for each of them.
Wow.
But that would not be easily achieved, at the time in the 1970s, 80s, 90s in Vietnam. And even the priests and religious who are there now are heavily influenced by how they can carry out their duties by the communist government. So it's not as free as what the world tends to see.
Sure. Is there an official religion in Vietnam?
Not official religion, but what I will say that before the end of the war, Buddhism was a predominant religion. But I would say that since the French influence in the 1950s, the spread of Christianity and Catholicism is what has brought the rise and prevalence of Catholicism among Vietnamese.
Okay.
And Christianity.
Okay.
So
yeah.
So people always like, wonder like how did your family have 2 Catholic priests when it was mostly Buddhist? Well, there's a point there where missionaries do their work and the word is spreading.
Yeah. So did your parents grow up Catholic or Christian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Catholic. Yeah. I don't know of as far as like going back to my grandparents and great grandparents that any of them were not Catholic. Mm-hmm. So I didn't hear anything about, Buddhism and my great-grandparents on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was something that you all grew up in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But one thing that is prevalent, regardless of the faith, is something called Confucianism. Mm-hmm. And that's just the respect of elders and ancestry. Some people call ancestry worship, but it's not really worship. It's really just honoring your ancestors and filial piety, which I had a greater appreciation for reading books about the, Asian American women experience, like when I was in college, because it's really a cultural thing, not so much a religious, thing.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And very interesting as I've traveled, seeing how different cultures practice the same religion. Mm-hmm. It just gives you such a broader understanding of God, in my opinion, that God is accessed in many different ways by many different people. And I believe that, he welcomes that as well, because our cultures all inform the way that we worship God. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting thing to experience as everybody practices in their own way, but as somebody that has traveled and seen different aspects of it. So I do try to have an appreciation for the cultural nuances of faith.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think especially around like the New Year's, the Lunar New Year, which we used to, call like Chinese New Year or Vietnamese New Year, but we realized many other countries celebrate it, so we call it the Lunar New Year. And it usually falls like February to March every year. That the importance of keeping up culture and the honoring of ancestors is really promoted, right? Regardless of your faith. And so we'll being a Catholic, you could walk into a shop that is, the owners are Buddhists, and they'll have an altar for the ancestors with fruits and everything and candles. And we're like, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. And some Catholic homes may even have that. It doesn't mean you worship your ancestors as God, but it's still passing on a cultural practice that honors your ancestors.
Yeah, beautiful. So in the refugee camp, how do you move from refugee camp to continental U.S.? You said you landed in Louisiana? Okay. So what was that process like?
So my oldest brother, he said that him and, several of the older siblings, had taken small jobs here and there and earned some income with the hopes of earning enough money to raise funds for our flight, like a big family, right? So it took years. But also we were sponsored by Catholic Charities, and which is what brought us to Louisiana. And it's a small town called Versailles, where many refugees settled as well after the war.
Okay.
And priests were there, and they started a church there, and nuns were there, So we immersed into American culture, but also kept Vietnamese culture. So we had American priests and nuns who worked with Vietnamese priests and nuns who still taught catechism and gave us our sacraments and had mass and many celebrations, with Marian processions and saints that were celebrated. So that's kind of how we landed in Louisiana.
Yeah.
I don't think we were like, hey, we want to go to Louisiana.
Yeah.
There were others, like when I've read other people's books on their refugee stories, some of them were fortunate to fly directly from, like, say, the Philippines or Hong Kong or some other refugee camp to the States, and they were sponsored by families or the church. So one of my friends who wrote a book, it's called I Didn't Miss the Boat. And she was also a boat person as well. And I think her dad built a boat and, helped settle a lot of other people, not just her family. But she got sponsored, they were in Arkansas. You know?
Yeah.
Like, imagine going from the refugee camp to Arkansas. She goes, I didn't choose that. It's like all of a sudden you went, the United Nations had a list and you just had to go there and say, oh, we got picked today. And this family decided to sponsor us.
I think it's a really good point, and just understanding the refugee experience, that you don't have a lot of choices. You kind of just have to take what you're given. And I've spoken to a couple of people on the show about their refugee experience and coming to the States. And it's one of my earliest episodes. I was talking to a man who's from Somalia and was in a refugee camp in Kenya and then was moved to Minnesota.
Yeah.
And it's like, he was like, I don't know why Minnesota, because the cold was totally new for us.
Yeah, that's what my friend said. She went from, I think it's the Philippines or something. And she's like, it's this hot, sweaty weather, mosquitoes, everything. And then she goes to Arkansas. She's like, I need to buy a coat.
Yeah. Never needed a coat before. Now I need one. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So you grew up, obviously you were very small, so you were learning to speak while you were in, English speaking places. And so you're learning English and Vietnamese at the same time. You've already said that it was more difficult for your older siblings that were already very much had settled themselves in ways in Vietnam. How did your parents do with kind of acclimating to U.S. culture?
So I recall my dad when in Louisiana, they had language classes in the evening, and he tried. He went to classes, but being in his 40s, he would learn things, and then 2 weeks later he'd come back and he's forgot what he learned 2 weeks ago, and he's like, I don't remember what I learned. I'm now you're telling me to learn some more stuff. So he couldn't keep up with it enough to take a job that required fluency. So his work was mainly with my uncles in warehousing, stocking, supermarket, really manual labor things. And then they also kept up with his fishing industry background, so they had a boat that they were able to join and, go fishing. And that's kind of how they earned a little bit of income here and there. My mom, because all she knew after marrying my dad was how to handle fish and seafood. So she got periodically jobs at the market where they needed people to clean fish and fish to display it in the store.
Yeah.
And it wasn't every day you got a job. It was just, hey, we need somebody today. And so it was just all word of mouth. So they'd have a van or a bus that would take workers, to the places that was needed. And so they just earned very menial jobs just to get by. But the government helped us initially. But I would say that all of my older siblings, their goal for all of us was to get an education so that we wouldn't be dependent on that and give back to society. Yeah. So that's always been our goal since college.
Yeah.
Once we graduated. Yeah.
That's awesome. Look, I mean, there are times when help is necessary and, you don't have a choice and your options are very limited. So.
Yeah. And I think that having that experience, knowing about that, is what, keeps us grounded and grateful. And then when you're grateful about the little things, then you're more likely to be generous.
Yeah.
And that's just my perspective on that. I have 7 nieces and 3 nephews. They were born here in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s.
Yeah.
And so they don't have that perspective of, what it's like to suffer.
Yeah.
Right? To face challenges, to struggle with a language or a culture, to find income, to not know whether you can pay your next, rent.
Sure.
Or whether there's food on the table. And so I remind them of that. And that's why, I wrote my book, Live to Give, is because I wanted to, in particular, share that with the younger generation, especially my nieces and nephews, but to instill a sense of gratitude in the community, in the youth, and in people who've never had a refugee experience to know where we come from.
Yeah. I mean, my family was not refugees, but you know what? My great-grandparents came over from Italy and just my grandparents were storytellers, and which I really appreciated about them. They shared a lot about their lives and about their experiences growing up. And my grandfather in particular, growing up in South Philly and like very poor, his parents were immigrants. And, I do recognize the change in each generation. When you don't have that experience, it's hard to kind of tether yourself to that experience and to the gratitude that comes with living through something like that. And so it must be interesting to kind of hold in tension the fact that, of course, you don't want your family members to suffer. You don't want people to suffer through things just for the sake of suffering. But at the same time, there is a knowledge and an empathy and a well of a gratitude that comes with walking through those experiences.
Yeah, for sure. And I think over time, when people like in my family who are younger, who take time to reflect on that and listen, right? Just listen to their parents and their aunts and uncles and really reflect on how blessed they are in their journey.
Yeah.
You don't have to suffer in order to be grateful, right? As long as you take time to listen and appreciate other people's challenges that they had to go through for you to be where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. You are not an island. None of us got to where we are completely by ourselves. Yeah. I think that's just an important perspective, period, right? We are all needing community in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
So you were in Louisiana, but we're in Illinois right now. Is your family spread out, or did you guys kind of, move around together? How did that work?
So about 1980, my oldest brother, in the process of moving to mainland United States, he was sponsored by the Diocese of San Jose to complete his training in the seminary to become a Catholic priest by the time he was 27.
Okay.
So he lived away from the family. So he's in California, northern, and then kind of explored California and talked to my parents. And they wanted, my dad being that he was a fisherman background, he wanted to live in a place that was close to the ocean.
Sure.
So they chose Southern California. And then in 1980, we said, let's take the Amtrak train. And we did the Amtrak train. It took several days, stops and stuff. And then we ended up in Southern California.
Okay.
We rented apartments. Sometimes we had 2 bedrooms for all of us. And the landlord at that time was fine with that, as long as we figured out how to be comfortable.
Yeah.
And then we would move to like a 3-bedroom apartment. It was like renting until 1987 or so was when the house was bought.
Okay.
It was like 4-bedroom, like 2 floors, garage. Wow. Yeah, there's air conditioning.
Oh, yeah.
There's a little yard. My mom could have a garden. It was just like amazing. And I was in junior high and transitioning to high school. So I was between like, can I stay with my friends I grew up with? And at that point, I had to separate 2 different high schools, kind of like starting over again.
Yeah.
And I went from being in schools where lots of Vietnamese people to I was like one of maybe 5.
Oh, okay.
Kind of like a class of 200 and something.
Yeah.
I was like, wow. So, adaptation. But I would say that was like a big move, a big transition. But it made the biggest difference in terms of being able to access, more affordable public education, as far as college.
Okay.
And the University of California system and Cal State, things like that. My brother just saw it as an opportunity that we needed to get out and go to California.
Yeah.
So that's what happened.
Yeah.
And then lots of our relatives were, still in Louisiana. And I would say even, by my dad passed in 2018, my mom in 2021. And to that day, like many relatives were still in Louisiana.
Okay.
Because they just got very comfortable
Sure.
being around other Vietnamese families and relatives. Whereas for us, we wanted to transition and really immerse ourselves in the culture.
Yeah.
We still went to Vietnamese masses and was involved in many cultural celebrations throughout the year. But as far as education, career development, that was kind of the focus.
Yeah.
So,
is there a big Vietnamese community in Southern California?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in Orange County in particular, there's something called Little Saigon.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is, you name any shop, whether it's food. I always say if you go to a Vietnamese restaurant, it's very rare that you just go and say, I want to go to eat Vietnamese food. It's like, what food?
Yeah.
Because some restaurants, like, they only do noodles. Some restaurants only do, specific crepes or family style. So you have to be specific.
Okay.
And then the more specific you choose for a restaurant, the better it is, because that's like, they just make it really good because that's their focus,
Okay. Good to know.
Same thing with desserts, So it's just like going to ice cream, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's true. There are different levels of ice cream shops, so you are not wrong. So, okay, veering off a little bit here, but I'm curious. It's somebody that may not have a whole lot of experience with Vietnamese food. What's something or a couple things you recommend for people to try to kind of get their feet wet there?
So pho, it's spelled PHO, is the traditional Vietnamese noodle. And it's a broth base. It comes in beef of the traditional. They'll have chicken, seafood, vegetarian. But, if you go to Little Saigon, you'll see pho restaurants everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's one. My favorite dish it's a seafood crepe, and it's called bánh xèo. It's BANH, and then the last word is XEO.
Oh, okay.
And it just the sound of when you pour the batter, it just makes that sound. Yeah. And so that's, and I would say that if you went to a family style Vietnamese restaurant and they had that on the dish, then it's traditional.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I'm going to tuck that away.
Because I would say if you had 10 restaurants that's family style Vietnamese, there might be one that has it.
Okay.
Because it takes skill to make it and special equipment, and you just have to know.
Well, now I feel like I'm going to be well equipped to find a Vietnamese restaurant to eat at. So it's good information.
Even here in Rockford, Illinois, there's only 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I'm going to have to get those from you.
And I'll drive 30 minutes. Just to get it.
Of course.
Because I'm craving it.
Yes. You got to go for the good stuff if you're going to do it. Because I imagine you can make stuff at home too.
Yeah. But I would say those 2 are pretty much the classics.
Yeah.
Other than that, if you're looking for like a family dinner, fish broths are pretty classic.
Yeah.
With rice and then kind of fried fish. So those are the ones whenever we gather as a family, it'd always be, and you look at all the dishes.
Yeah.
There's always a soup. There's always a fried fish.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. I do love trying new things, but it's always so overwhelming to know like what to pick, right? If you walk in, if it's your first time eting a new food or a culture's food, you're like, what's the thing? What is the thing that I should try? That I don't want to go to a Thai restaurant and order, chicken pad Thai every time because I feel like a loser American doing that.
No, there was one time here in Rockford, I went to a Vietnamese restaurant and I ordered that bánh xèo, and the lady behind me, I don't know how many times she's eaten there or just her first time, but she watched it come out and it was like sizzling. And then she goes, "What is that?" And I told her. So then I cut like a slice and I put fish sauce in there.
Nice.
So would you like some? And then she's like, "Oh my gosh, that would make my day." And she ate it and she loved it.
Oh,
yeah,
and now that's what she's going to order next time.
Order it now. Yeah.
That's right. That's great. So, all right, back to the story.
Now we're thinking of food.
I know. So you have mentioned that your family had an emphasis on development and education and becoming contributing members of society. It was really important to your family. And I'm assuming that was, something your parents also fostered and encouraged as well.
Absolutely.
So, and you had your seed planted before you even knew about becoming a doctor. So, tell me about your journey to that, how you actually chose that and how you chose to be doing what you're doing now.
So I would say, like, in childhood, I had lots of relatives that would come and visit, and being one of 10 kids, many of them couldn't remember our names. But I was always referred to the kid that nearly died in Guam. And that was when I got curious, like, what do you mean I nearly died in Guam? And so that's the story. But in college, I'd say maybe backtrack. In junior high, I had many like experiences with immersion into science and Saturday, workshops with more individualized experiences, like with experiments and just watching demonstrations on Saturdays with different professors. Some came from college, and it was just very, very unique. And only a handful of students got picked because of our passion for it. So that was one where I was like, oh, science. I really like science, I enjoyed learning about the human body and disease and, treatments and seeing like when we got better, why, right? So in college, I volunteered at the hospital. I did 6 months in the emergency room and then 2.5 years on Saturdays in the neonatal intensive care unit, and where I got to hold babies and feed them. Nurses taught me all that, and I was like afraid, like they're so fragile, and,
Yeah.
But like knowing that I had coaching.
Yeah.
And being able to be around the environment for 4 hours every Saturday for 2.5 years, seeing doctors and nurses and how their life and how much of a difference they made, and the stories that were told about them doing mission trips to Russia or other countries and bringing babies and their moms back here and doing surgeries that couldn't be done elsewhere or couldn't afford it. So it just put, in my heart, like, wow, I want to be like that. And I knew I wanted to work with kids. I wanted something where it was slower than the ER. I really wanted a relationship. I got to be able to follow, people throughout their journey of health.
Yeah.
So I knew for sure it wasn't going to be the ER. There was somebody
intense.
with children. Yeah. And so I pursued that. I also worked for a pathologist in college, and he's now passed away, but he was an MD, PhD. And I remember asking him, if you could do it all over again, would still be an MD, PhD? And he says, I would go the MD route because you get to be with people. And if you want to do research, you can still do research.
Okay.
And so that gave me kind of, okay, that's how it worked, So I explored that. And then that's led me to medicine. After 4 years of medical school, I did training in residency for internal medicine and pediatrics because I still couldn't let go of the adult care.
Okay.
Because I was like, there's complexities in adult care and there's preventive care in children.
Yeah.
But the nutrition and the interest in, procedures and GI led me to do a fellowship in PGI.
Okay.
So that's like basically my journey.
Yeah.
In, 5 minutes.
Yeah. A long, I'm sure, expensive and arduous journey in 5 minutes. So I know you do work with children, and your focus has been on childhood obesity. So what kind of got you into that?
When we talk about preventive care, it's always been in the back of my mind that there are things traditionally that's always worked, which is a good, healthy lifestyle and appropriate diet. And we have the knowledge and the skills to overcome barriers to developing a healthy lifestyle. That's the solution to obesity management. So when I was in fellowship, I always saw like so many kids that would come in with prediabetes or diabetes, fatty liver disease. And I just knew that if I could change their diet and help them plant a seed of curiosity and knowledge on the appropriate diet, portion sizes, taking into account the cultural differences, that I could make a difference. And I saw that. I saw when they made those changes and they lost weight, that their liver enzymes got better and overall health, like they went from pre-diabetes to no diabetes, right? Or diabetes to no longer diabetic, getting off medicines, things like that. And it was the challenge was, getting people to motivate themselves to do it, right? So that led me to recognize that some of the barriers is access to the knowledge of what's healthy eating, what's an appropriate portion size, the fact that sugary beverages are addictive and not good for you, what's appropriate physical activity every day, the amount of screen time you should or should not be having, the amount of sleep you need. Yeah. And social anxiety, right, that prevent people from being in a outside in group settings to be active.
Sure.
So that's when I formed a nonprofit, which has now November 6, 2014, and it's called Faithful to Fitness.
Oh, wow.
And what I did was said, we get paid as in healthcare to take care of people, but there's people who can't afford the basics of a dietitian or, learning about where food comes from, right? Grocery shopping. How do I shop on a budget? and not be overwhelmed with it's too expensive to eat healthy, which isn't true. So the nonprofit provides free exercise classes with a local gym for 1 hour every Saturday. It provides a support group, right, to see that, hey, all these families and kids are coming together. We're all struggling. We can all do it. And we're going to work out together. And this is when we're going to meet. And we look forward to that every Saturday. We provide a free nutrition lessons from a dietitian who volunteers. Take kids to the farm, learn how to harvest vegetables, how vegetables are grown. It inspired kids to pursue becoming a farmer.
Wow.
Which is only 2% of the U.S. population.
Wow.
That provides food for the whole country. Oh, and then take kids grocery shopping and reading labels and choosing to eat something different than what they've been doing.
Yeah.
Try something new, being just more conscious of what they're putting in their body.
Yeah.
Right? Avoiding the energy drinks and the sugary beverages. And so that's made an impact, and it's really the impact is not like every single person. It's impact on the people who absorb the knowledge and take advantage of the opportunity to overcome those barriers.
Yeah.
So I can tell you just 2 years ago, one 14-year-old who was on insulin for type 2 diabetes, after a year and a half with our program, got off insulin.
Wow.
I mean, do you ever hear that? You don't hear stories like that, right? You hear people once they're on their own, right?
Yeah, forever.
They may use less, but he was determined to eat better, exercise better, lose weight. Even his doctor was shocked, like, how'd you do that? But he really took on the role of, it's me and my body, and I'm going to take care of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I have so much running through my head right now. And I'm like trying to sort my questions for you. But I think the idea of in most things in life, prevention is better than rehabilitation, right? It's usually less expensive. Rehabilitation, again, in most things, must be continued in perpetuity. So if you can prevent something from happening, you are obviously saving that person from a lot of struggle, but you're also saving, economically, it's a lot better as well.
Healthcare costs, yeah. Yeah, I always tell medical students, because I teach about childhood obesity intervention and share my nonprofit at least once a year at the med school here. I always say, if you want to save on healthcare costs in the U.S. especially, start with obesity. Yeah. And start with children. Because when I introduced my, a blueprint for childhood obesity in my nonprofit, a lot of people question, like, why children? Why not adults? I say, well, if you get the child involved, who's bringing them to the classes? So the whole family's involved. Yeah. Right? We require that the parents and guardians participate in every activity. So let's say they say, oh, I can't do this because I had a knee replacement or my hips hurt. Well, sit on the chair and use your arms. Yeah. Right? Do yoga, do stretches. You can do things, right?
That's great.
And then even if you can't do it, be there. Don't just drop them off and leave. Because it's not like sitting on the sidelines and cheering them on in a soccer game. It's different when you actually have to do what they're doing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you appreciate more the challenges that they're facing. Yeah. With trying to just get active and moving.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you put something into practice and then becomes more of a habit than anything else. And you're not working against the flow of each other, right? Do you find that there are certain... I want to be careful with the way that I say this. Do you find that there are certain groups that are more predisposed to this? And I don't necessarily mean like genetically, but culturally or even socioeconomically.
Yeah, for sure. Before I started my nonprofit in between 2012, 2013, I was in Georgia after my fellowship, and I worked with a pediatric resident who's now a peds GI in Atlanta. And we wrote up a grant to the American Academy of Pediatrics. We were awarded almost $3,000 because they believe that our concept, our blueprint to create a community-based childhood obesity intervention program was something that can be replicated across the country. And that's what led me to the nonprofit. And what we learned from there is 75% of the participants that were enrolled in the grant program were on Medicaid and low income, underserved. And like about half to a little more than half were Hispanic, and about the other half was African American. And so certainly from that, we can see, objectively, those are the patients that we were helping.
Yeah.
And the responding to the call, of the service that we're offering. So many people are invited, not everybody answers the call for the invitation.
Sure.
Same thing is true here in the last 10 years that I've worked here in my nonprofit. I would say many of the people that I've helped are Hispanic, but here there's also Caucasians as well. So it's just the population.
Yeah.
But, many challenges with chronic disease and diabetes in the Hispanic community. And they acknowledge it.
Yeah.
The dietitians see it in the hospitals. And part of it is knowledge of what is healthy and portion control.
Okay.
We had a teenage boy who he was showing us his portion size. We have like a plate, my plate method. And we asked him how much meat he was eating, and he was explaining the amount of meat he was eating. And we said, "Why are you eating that much meat?" He said, "Because I'm supposed to eat as much as my dad so I can be as big as him."
Oh, wow.
And when my dietitian explained that your age,
Yeah.
you'll get there, but you don't need to eat the same as him right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's a cultural thing that we had to help him overcome.
Sure.
That's an example.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, but it's a good example
Yeah,
because I think, we can very easily fall into this trap of thinking that it's a moral defect or that it's laziness that causes this. And, I'm not saying that can't be part of the reason for some people, but it's more than that. It's deeper than that. And it's, you don't know what you don't know. And culture is strong. And culture, not even like your ethnic culture, but like your
environment.
Yes, your environment.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That it is.
An environment is a barrier to the development of a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
I mentioned that when I give talks to the medical students too. So when we say environment, it's who you're around, right? So if you're around people who encourage you, let's say, to go drinking, right? Okay, it's going to be difficult to not drink.
Yeah.
Right. Same thing. If you're around people who take you to, go out to eat a lot and fast food is a thing, it's going to be hard not to eat fast food regularly.
Sure.
So that's considered like the environment, which isn't necessary culture only.
Right.
But it's who motivates you and who influences you.
Yeah. And I imagine it's a self-perpetuating cycle as well, right? Because again, you don't know what you don't know. And so you can't always say, "Oh, these parents are terrible." They're like, they may not know themselves, right? Because that's what they were taught. Yeah. And so I think entering in with generosity and compassion is an important part of, and not from a medical perspective, but just from a human perspective of seeing people and understanding that the reasoning behind something is usually deeper than, oh, this person's bad or...
Yeah, and I think part of that compassion is also acknowledging human dignity, right? Because all of us struggle in a different way.
Sure.
Like I was preparing for a talk for tomorrow night at my church, and I'm focused on the concept of mercy, right? Having mercy for people from the works that we do spiritually and for the body, right? Educating themselves on the works of mercy. And when we have compassion, then we can instill mercy in the work that we do.
Yeah.
But part of that mercy is recognizing that we all come with barriers and challenges and struggles and burdens that it's not written on our face, and it's not like, hey, here's a sign to tell you what I'm struggling with, right?
Yeah.
But I think the key there is to see that, for example, when I work in medical mission in El Salvador, people don't get clean water, right? And there's millions of people out there every day who don't have clean water.
Yeah.
And to help them get clean water is part of acknowledging human dignity.
Yes.
The same way with starvation and hunger, homelessness, addiction, acknowledging that there is a struggle, that's there, and not saying I can't do anything about it, but what can I do? I can't fix everything, but I can do small things.
Yeah.
So that's the same thing here.
And I think even acknowledging human dignity and, I like to think about it as, the Imago Dei, we're all made in the image of God. And so there is inherent dignity in us as beings. And so even acknowledging that goes such a long way, because when you acknowledge that, you can't look at somebody and say they don't deserve help or they should continue to suffer. I think if we could all get there, that would go such a long way.
It does. Yeah, it does. Yeah, one of the people that helps us with the families in El Salvador that need some clean water, the one thing we do every year is to get donations for water filters that are like $40. But that $40 filter gets installed in a family and it gives them clean water for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
But imagine how much what we do with $40 every day.
Yeah.
Right? That could be a lunch. It could be a dinner.
Yes.
Right? But how much of a difference that $40 makes for somebody for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? That's a small way of, acknowledging what we can do to acknowledge human dignity by providing clean water for someone who can't have it.
Yeah.
Now, we can't really, what we'll say is, I can't go fix the filtration system in El Salvador. Well, nobody's asking you to do that.
Yeah.
One family at a time.
Sure. It makes a difference to that family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even, your next door neighbor. And I just think it's important to realize that we have no idea what people are walking through. And so to approach just in general with that understanding that we really have very little knowledge about somebody else's experience. And so to kind of assume it in that way that the way that they behave or the way that they live, if it's different from us, that, there's a reason for that. And we don't have to understand it to be kind to them and to offer compassion. And again, I think dignity is the perfect word.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you are also an author, which you've alluded to a couple of times, but I would love to hear about, that process as well. What inspired you to take your expertise and write it down? And you have several books here. So yeah, tell me about that.
So Live to Give is my first book here. And it's Live to Give, an inspirational memoir about freedom, faith, and selflessness. So the cover, I helped design it with my editor. And it focuses on time, talent, and treasure, and all in the hands of God, offered up.
Yeah.
All of us should think about those three things are gifts that God gives to us.
Yeah.
And we don't own it. We have to offer it up to use it in the right way to make a difference in society.
Yeah.
So this book took me about 10 years. And it was always something I felt like one day I wanted to be a published author.
Yeah.
And I didn't know when, and I didn't really know how it was going to all come together. But I would say like sometime in 2008, I was in middle fellowship, and one day my sister came and said, she's a dentist, and patients would come and, while she's working on them, she would talk to them about our family and how we were one of 10 kids, this is what happened. And like so many people would tell her that somebody in your family needs to be an author. Right? And so my sister put a seed in my head that I would be the person to write a book about my family.
There you go.
And so it started out as a family memoir, and then it became like I would write stories and paragraphs and chapters and ideas and things that would inspire me. I would sit on the plane in the airport on vacation. I would get bored of doing stuff, and I'm like, I got an idea.
Yeah.
So I would write things down. And over time, it all came together, and then I started dividing it into chapters, and my editor rearranged things, and that's how it all happened.
Amazing.
But the focus that I found in over 10 years of working on it was that what touched me was the concept of encouraging people to be more giving. And I just didn't see a lot of that in healthcare, surprisingly. All of us go into healthcare saying, I want to help people. But the process of training is so grueling, and then the cost of training, the debt that people, assume. And then it's like somewhere along the way, a lot of people get lost.
Yeah.
And then they become very self-absorbed and worried about I deserve this, I deserve that, because I work so hard. Sure, we do.
Yeah.
But we also should think about how blessed we are and how we can give back with the blessings that we've been given.
Yeah.
But definitely my refugee story always stuck with me. It never went away, and that's why I share that.
Yeah.
Most people can read this book within 3 to 4 days. I'm not a literary expert, English major, anything. So I write from my heart, and I write about stories, and I think stories inspire people. There's also, so the freedom is the refugee story. The faith is my faith journey and how it influences my career, my personal life. And selflessness is about sharing the concept of generosity.
Yeah.
So that's my memoir. This was published by Hilton Publishing December 1st, 2020.
Okay.
So I took the 2020 year.
Yes, good for you.
And I finished it and got a publisher to accept it and everything. So that was fun.
I wish I could say that. I cannot. So good for you.
But from there, I did speakers training with several coaches and started podcasting and got invited to write 2 other books with women.
Awesome.
So the second book is The Confidence of Yes. And basically sharing each woman writing a chapter, sharing the story of how we said yes to what we do. Mm-hmm. And then the third book, which was just published 2 years ago. And, this and The Confidence of Yes, were Amazon bestsellers.
Awesome.
Also, all women authors. And in here, we share our stories of how we overcame mediocrity.
Oh.
And I share a lot of the stories about my nonprofit.
Okay.
In there, and stories of specific, people that I helped and how I helped them overcome adversity and mediocrity.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's great. That's an interesting perspective too, because I think some people probably don't look at their lives and say, like, maybe I haven't faced a lot of adversity, right? And so they're like, I can't relate to something that's about like a rags to riches story necessarily, but to get yourself out of a rut or to, start something new, I think that's something that everybody can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, it sounds like when I first encountered the invitation for overcoming mediocrity, and I thought, man, I don't really want to sound like I'm, up there. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it can turn off people, right?
Yeah.
But I think the key here is to recognize that we can always better our best. Yeah. Even if we think we've done it all, we're the best we can be. One of my favorite authors is Matthew Kelly.
Okay.
And he's from Australia, but he is here in the U.S. And I would say that since 2014, I've been reading his books pretty regularly, sometimes like one every month, sometimes 2 a month.
Yeah.
But pretty much like he gets a book out and like I'm there,
Okay.
And but he really inspired me about this phrase, which is how are you working towards becoming the best version of yourself? And I'm like, you know what? Our version like 20 years ago can always be improved.
Yes.
Our version today can be improved tomorrow.
Yeah. I agree.
And I think that's that. And then better or best is another thing that I heard from a business mentor like in the last 2 years. So if we strive for that, then we don't live a mediocre life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you stop learning, you stop growing.
Yeah.
And we never arrive, right? So I like to say that if you can look at yourself 5 years ago and you're the same exact person, you should be worried.
They say if you're ripe, you're rotten.
Yeah, there you go. Yes. I like that. I'm gonna start using that one.
Courtesy of a business mentor that told me that.
Perfect.
Like, that sounds great. Let me rethink if I'm ripe or rotten.
Yeah. Hey, I like it. I should always be learning. Should always be, not quite there. So what's next for you? You got 3 books under your belt. You're doing medical missions. You're teaching. You're practicing still. Yeah. I mean, I feel kind of silly saying what's next because you feels like you've done it all. But what is next? What are you thinking?
This year, I am working with my first publisher, Hilton Publishing, to get a children's book published. Yeah. Actually, I had written up a first draft of the text of the children's book. It started out as like an adult book, and then it shortened it to a children's book. We're aiming for an audience of 6 to 8 years of age.
Yeah.
And it's focused on coping with loss. But it's a children's book, so it's quite unique. There might be some books out there related to that for children, but, our approach to it is a little bit different.
Okay.
So
that's exciting.
It's a very heroic approach to how you cope with loss. Yeah. And there's a faith-based component that's woven into there. There's saint stories. There's pets involved.
Oh, cool.
There's humans involved.
Yeah. Have to have pets involved, obviously.
I mean, my current pet is one of the heroes in there.
I was going to ask.
And we adopted 2 dogs. So our first dog passed in October of 2021. And so we look back, and he was actually born on May 18th. And that's the birthday of St. John Paul II.
Oh, okay.
And he passed away on October 18th, which is the patron saint of Dr. St. Luke.
Oh.
And so we're like, oh, okay, let me weave that story.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and then Percy, the Pamapu that we have right now, she'll be 9 on July 13th.
Oh, my goodness.
And I just came back from pilgrimage in Fatima and Lourdes. So July 13th is the 3rd apparition of Fatima, Our Lady of Fatima.
Okay.
So I'm like, gosh, I was just surrounded by these like saintly, holy pets. I mean, they're calling me to like, please include me as a hero in your future book.
Absolutely.
I can't help it.
Absolutely.
But I even have on my little altar there, the statue of Saint Francis and books about in honor of our Corky, the Yorkie, right next to St. Francis. So they've all been blessed when we take them to pet blessings in October on his feast day.
Cute.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so sweet. I love it. I love it. When you said children's book, I was like, duh, that would, of course, have to be the next thing for you. You work with children. It's a book. That makes a lot of sense. So that's really cool.
And I think what inspired me was after I lost my first dog, then in December 2021, so 2 months later, my mom passed. And I always felt like writing was a way to cope with a lot of things that I dealt with.
Yep.
And grief was one of the ways, I was faced with very quickly, and when I wrote about how I was dealing with all that.
Yeah.
And that's what led me to say, oh, let's write a book. And I realized an opportunity for writing a children's book was there with the same publisher.
Yeah.
Who proposed, like, can you rewrite this for age 6 to 8? I'm like,
oh, interesting.
Sure. Please shorten it to this many words and many pages. And then, so this year, what we're trying to do is connect me with one of the illustrators.
Yep.
So we'll see what happens.
Exciting.
Yeah, we thought we could get it, before, but with a lot of challenges and publication costs and stuff. So we'll see what happens this year.
Well, that's exciting.
I'll be in touch.
Yes,
You'll
please
get a
do.
copy.
I want to see it. I want to read it. Give it to my nieces
But
who are in your age range. So it's perfect.
But that's my goal, and my other goal is just to keep doing the annual medical mission.
Yeah.
I just came back from pilgrimage, our first one together with my husband, and we're trying to go maybe in a couple of years again somewhere. So
wonderful.
We have some plans.
Do you always go to El Salvador for medical mission?
So far, I've done 2.
Okay.
And so it's always in like February or March.
Okay.
And we're there for, 9 or 10 days.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. Very exciting. Well, I love it. I love your story. I love what you're doing. I think you are making such a huge difference in the world, and it's a fabulous thing to see. And you're creating a legacy that will outlive you, which is, I think, the best we can hope for as human beings.
Yeah.
So
that's what I have thought about for a long time. And when I started in healthcare, I thought, can I do this? Will I really leave a legacy? But I think even before I went to medical school, Dr. Patch Adams, the movie that was the late Robin Williams starred as Dr. Patch Adams, that he's always been kind of an inspiration for me from the beginning, and just bringing the humanity to everything we do in healthcare. So it's important. If I can leave that kind of legacy, I don't know if I'll have a movie like Patch Adams, but certainly it would be wonderful if I was remembered in a similar way. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, we're gonna hope that happens for you. I do have a question that I ask everybody at the end of each episode, which is, through the lens of your experiences, what does compassion mean to you?
I think compassion is seeing people's misery and bringing love and mercy to that. And I think that's really the key. Not judging, but saying, what can I do to help that person through their struggle?
Yeah.
So that's it.
I love it. It's simple in concept, but sometimes we have a issue in practice. So it's something that we have to practice for sure.
And that's part of being the best version of ourselves.
Yep. Bring it all back. Well, once again, thank you for having this in your home. It was very lovely to be
My
here.
pleasure.
In your bright orange space. It's very nice and inviting. So, yeah, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to hearing about your children's book. We'll link everything in the notes for your books, any socials or anything like that. And so people will be able to follow along and see what you're up to next.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on your show. And I hope my story inspires your audience.
I'm sure it will.
Thank you for listening to The Human Experience. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, share it on social media, and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also support the podcast financially by going to my website, thehxpod.com, linked in the show notes, and clicking on Donate. It takes a lot of time and resources to create this podcast, so every little bit helps. Everyone has a story, and I'd love to hear yours. So be sure to check out the show notes for more information about how to stay in touch. Do good and love well.